in 150. Before we start, I want to say that we have about 40 slides and 20 minutes, so we will go through over the slides, and at the end of the session, we will be able to answer your question. First, I want to give you some tips about the new best practices. The new best practices bring to us new features. Those features will be available from version 150 and beyond. The latest best practices might reverse some of the current best practices. For example, earlier we said don't use stable IDs. Now we say use stable IDs. So some of the best practices have no immediate impact, but they prepare for future compatibility. And keep in mind that the most enhancements of those new best practices are for users and not for developers. We will go through those topics: the stable IDs, asynchronous loading, AMD module definition, avoid global asynchronous APIs, and future enhancements. So we will start with stable IDs. Why we need stable IDs? Actually, stable IDs are important when implementing tests. For example, OPA test, because they will make our test more reliable. Also, stable IDs will make troubleshooting more easily. We need them also with support assistant, as I will show an example here. So I will use, we have a troubleshooting up here. So first I will activate the support assistant by pressing Control Alt Shift and B. Then I will activate the support assistant. I think most of you know the support assistant. I will activate all the rules and click on Analyze. So we see some errors and warning in our app. So if I choose the unresolved binding rule, we see that we have an ID with control heap of chats --app label has unresolved binding path. It's easy to us to find this control in the view, because this control has an ID label and it's in the view, in the app view. For other rule, for example, we see here we have an SAPUI layout rule, and we have some controls. We have a control with ID underscore layout 1 has the rules called content not allowed. So it's hard to us to find this rule, to find this control in the view, because we don't use here stable IDs. So stable IDs will make the troubleshooting more easily. So back to our slides. Also, we need stable IDs with RTR, real-time adaptation. Did you hear about it? The RTR enable or allow us to adapt the UI of our application. For example, add labels or fields, but this is allowed with special controls like object page. We will see a short video here. So in the FLP, we can go to Adapt UI, and as you can see, we have an object page layout control, and we can add field or remove fields. If you're interested, you can read more about. We have here a blog post.
And on the other side of that wall, there is the team flexibility having a booth all day long. You can ask them about runtime adaptation, and so they will answer everything you need to know.
So continue. Okay, where to define those stable IDs? For all controls, UI5 controls except XML views, simply we define the ID in the view. Don't use JavaScript code, JavaScript views because they don't follow the MVC model view controller concept. For some reason, if you want to create a control in the controller, using JavaScript code, then you must use the create ID method. For component, we will do this in the index.html. But this will be relevant for standalone applications because the FLP apps, they don't have index.html. For views, don't define the ID directly in the view, but we will do this in the manifest.json under the routing configuration. Why? Because as you know, the views will be displayed when navigate to them using the router. So we will define the view ID in the under the routing section in the target of the corresponding view. We have here an exception, the root view, because as you know, the root view is the initial view, will be displayed without routing. So we will define the ID under the root view section. Now we have another topic, asynchronous loading. As you know, asynchronous loading is much more better than synchronous loading because it leads to more performance. Also, you will not be blocked because your app is still loading its resources. I will show you a short an example here. We see this is a synchronous loading. It takes about 5 seconds to display the image, but with asynchronous loading, it's faster. So in the new best practice, we will not use synchronous loading anymore. So by default, the asynchronous loading is disabled. We have to enable it. This will be done in the index.html in the bootstrap. But again, this is relevant for standalone apps because for FLP apps, the Fury Launchpad will take care about this. And this line of code will have its effect on all the libraries and resources defined in the bootstrap. But this is but still we need to also load the component and the manifest asynchronously. So we will do this in the component definition. Be careful, the manifest property replaces the manifest first property in 150 version. Also, still we need to load the views asynchronously. This will be done again in the manifest.json. For all views in the routing section and for the root view in the root view section. So remember always to implement the stable IDs and the asynchronous loading together. As we see in the root view, we have ID and asynchronous together. So the next topic, AMD, like module definition. AMD stands for asynchronous module definition. As we said, the synchronous, we don't want to use any more synchronous, the synchronous loading. So don't use jQuery SAP declare and jQuery SAP require because they are synchronous methods. Instead, we will use the SAPUI define and SAPUI require. What is the difference between those two methods? The SAPUI define will first load its dependencies and then will execute the initial model. The SAPUI require this called static dependencies. The SAPUI require will load its dependencies after the execution of the initial model. And this called dynamic dependencies. A good example for dynamic dependencies when the user interact with the application. We will see a short example here. As you see, this is an old style of code. Don't use it. Instead we will use instead the declare, we will use the define. And how to okay, so as we see here, the define method, the define statement actually combines the declare and the require together. And also be careful the path here. Instead dot we have slash. As we see, the define has a dependency and a callback function. The callback function will be executed after loading the sub and button dependencies. And as we said, instead the jQuery require, we will use SAP require. This is the dynamic dependency. And as we said, a good example will be displaying a message box when the user click on a button. So because it's not needed to load, we don't need to load the sub and message box in the define. And this will reduce the overhead of our application. So we have another. We see here we have another old style code. Okay. So don't use this declaration, because the new building tool will not recognize the XY button. Instead, we will first load the dependency. Sorry, this is another. First, we have to load the we have to load the sub XY button dependency, and then we can execute the instance of. In version 1.56, we can do it another way. So by using the base object is a, and again we have to define the base object. We have to define the object dependency sub UI base object in the define, and then in the callback function we can check this using base object is. Another use case of sub UI define is to include the renderer in the define statement. As we know, every control has its renderer, and we know that this renderer will be used somewhere later in the code. So it's better to define it here to avoid asynchronous call later. So now Arnd will take over the rest of the presentation. So.
Okay, can you hear me? Yeah, microphone's on. Okay. We want to get rid of global namespaces. We want to reduce the functionality of jQuery sub, require, declare, whatever. We want to get rid of those, and we want to reduce the use of global sub.ui anything calls. We don't want to pollute our namespaces with global objects. We'll try to avoid this, and we will see how to do that. Okay. Asynchronous APIs. A lot of things we are talking about, mentioned Peter today in the keynote. We are trying to get UI5, the UI5 framework a little bit faster, and one step is to use the new build toolings and to gain profit from these build toolings, you have to adapt your application. You cannot just use it out of the box and have a faster performant application. You have to do something as a developer. You invest some more time on the developing side, and then all the users will benefit from this because it's a little bit faster. So you have the work and they have the fun. We try with 150 and all versions before 156 have now the opportunity to have this async flag. That's a switch, and we have this component here, this old style. You use just this namespace, and if you add this async true, then your SAPUI component behaves differently. It returns a promise, and all the asynchronous files we are using, other routines use promises. So after this is loaded, then you can consume it. This is all the style. You have always return. You get a promise returned, and then you can execute and work with it. With the version 156, which is out now as a beta release, so if you're dealing with the 90 builds, you can already consume them. You do not use this component directly. As I said, we want to get rid of those global namespaces because the build tooling won't find these things. You use SAPUI require, get your component, then you say create, which returns your promise, and then you consume it. This pattern will be from now on. You create or you load a component or a control, and then you consume it. You will see this pattern more often. Okay, for a component container, for example, this was the old way. Now you have to be more specific about that, and it looks a little bit more complex, but this is just coding. When you're loading libraries, you just loaded a library, not anymore. You use async true, you get a promised, and then after the loading, you can continue doing what you wanted to do. And while this is loaded, you can continue with your application. It's not blocked, so this is very handy. I18N texts are a little bit different. We still use jQuery sub resource. This time it will give you a promise, and then you consume it. We will try to get rid of this in near future because we want to get rid of jQuery sub. Here, loading views, old style. If you're using the new one, async true, then we have a new function here loaded. It's an event, and which returns the promise for you. Then you can continue and consume the loaded view. From 156 on, the same as with the component. You require the view, you create it, and then you can continue with the code and bring it forward. This is some outlook, things about to think. For example, here fragment. Fragments are not created; they are loaded because you normally get them from your application directly. This is old style, and now similar to the view or component, you require the fragment and then load it. You get a promise, and then you can consume it. It's always the same pattern, but you have to look up in the API if it's load or is it create, and we'll successively switch these functions. As I said, we want to avoid globals, and if you think it through, we want to get rid of anything that is SAPUI get core or get version info. They have to go. The only thing you will that will stay are SAPUI require and SAPUI define, and everything else is depending on that. So this is already merged in the latest build, I think. This is old style. We don't want to use globals anymore. You have to require it, and when it's loaded, then you can consume it. So we are already thinking about SAPUI get core, for example, by ID. You need that every day. You have to require the core to get your ID in future times. Okay, that was very, very quickly. Any questions to that? Okay.
So is SAP thinking about, for example, code migration tools, for example, for getting rid of globals?
Yeah, we thought about that. We discussed it, but I cannot promise you that we can provide that because
they don't have to work, so just ship what you have and give it to them.
That's a side product maybe of the build tool, because they already pass the code and analyze what's there and what's needed. We don't have the capacity to do this right now, but we thought about it, we talked about it, but there is no solution right now I can provide for you.
Yeah, actually, maybe the same question, but have you thought about using some like global variable, like for example, for loadage we just use underscore. What if we just have some UI5 and then you work with API? You don't need to type every time SAP, right? Even to require core, it's still a lot of letters you need to type. What if you just have UI5 and then dot and you use already API?
No, I can't answer that. We have to ask the product owner of the core. So if you want to have more details on those modelization, and so Andreas Ecker will have a session this afternoon about those modules, how to get more details and how to get only the modules you needed. If you've been to the Audimax before, then you heard about the build toolings. Merlin and Matthias will have a booth outside in the afternoon about the build tooling, which is very important. You can only benefit from those asynchronous things if you combine it with the build tooling, and I recommend talking to them. And it's what we call Think Evo. You have to think about what you are doing, what you want to achieve, not just bring up a small application, but a good and performant and fast application, and then you have to use this slightly more complicated versions of the commands you already liked a lot. Okay, any other questions? If not, then thank you for your attention, and we'll see you.